Michael, you say that a lot of these folks are into, basically bringing things back to nature, and that, let's say, offshore wind farms are a way to get there. Why is it that they're insensitive to the reality of, the right whale, for example? How does that work?
Yeah, it seems paradoxical for people who say they care so much about the natural world to promote energy sources, whether it's a big solar farm in Nevada or a big industrial wind farm off the coast of the East Coast, that directly kill endangered and threatened species. It seems paradoxical, but I think it's important to remember that the people that are advocating those projects are deeply ideological. They're very disconnected from the natural world. I see this all over the place. It's very striking to me that the people, for example, that don't live in California, that don't hike, in fact, people who sometimes admit that they don't hike or camp, are the people who absolutely freak out when there's a forest fire. And we have to remind them that fires are a natural part of forest ecosystems. Most forests require some amount of fire for seeds to regenerate, for the soil to regenerate. Now, we don't want the high intensity fires, we want the lower intensity fires. But journalists, for the most part, don't differentiate between those two things. I think what explains a lot of it, Jan, is that the people who are journalists, who work in the media, the elite who live in places like New York or Washington, D.C., but even in places like Berkeley or Boulder, Colorado, these are people who have very little connection to the productive sectors of the economy. Their parents and grandparents lived and worked in cities. These are people that rarely are in nature. They are attracted to the idea of nature, but they don't actually spend much time in nature or working with nature. They don't understand how to manage a forest. They don't understand that desert landscapes are full of life and are full of species. They don't understand that the fishermen of the Atlantic coast make great efforts to not harm whales. They have very sophisticated processes to avoid harming whales, and that you can't just go and build big industrial projects in places of critical habitat without killing endangered species. The life of progressive people tends to be very removed from physical realities, whether farming, fishing, hunting, manufacturing, trucking, just the kind of basic physical function of societies. And it's only getting worse. I mean, affluent people basically have all of their food and products delivered to them. It used to be that people thought that food came from supermarkets. They didn't know that it came from farms. Now we think it comes from an Amazon delivery truck. So there's a disconnection there. But the other is just ideology. Basically, people spend so much time online. People spend so much time in media that they become ideological. And so their idea of nature is very different from what nature actually is. And so we see also a forgetting of history. We had our worst heat waves in the 1930s, but people just they don't care. They don't have much of a memory anymore. We don't have much respect for our elders. We don't listen to older people. Some of this is uniquely American. We're a very youth culture. We're an anti-intellectual culture. We don't have a lot of respect for the past. But I do think some of it, is just ideological. Some of it is, and I think is on its way out. I mean, we have seen, I will say, it does matter to push back. I mean, I have seen a change in the media coverage just in the last few weeks where you finally start to see some reporters sort of say, well, yeah, if we managed the forests better, there would be fewer fires. And, oh, well, maybe we should worry about the right whale being hurt by these industrial wind turbines. That did get mainstream news media coverage, as did the killing of desert tortoises on a solar farm. So I do think that you can, in these environments, push back against it, but we are dealing with some long-term trends, that are in some ways just side effects of our success. When you become affluent and safe and secure, it can make you a little paranoid. It can make you a little neurotic. I mean, I'm in Berkeley, California. It's an older population now. We don't build enough houses to attract younger families. And I'm on the hiking trails still, and people are wearing masks. I mean, that's got to be considered some kind of a mental disorder. I mean, there's no mechanism for people to be getting sick, and they're all vaccinated anyway. So even if they had a little coronavirus, they wouldn't get very sick. So I just think these are kind of the neuroses of modern life. The good news is I think we can push back against them. The good news is I think that, media publications and outlets like yours provide a way to get the truth out in ways that many of the mainstream media have been censoring and excluding from view. But I do think that, there are new possibilities. And I'm finding a whole set of new friends these days with very different views on many different things, but we are all coming together, I think, pushing back against safetyism and victim culture.
How fascinating, and I appreciate your kind words.
I mean, really, it's been Epoch Times that's covered these issues with depth. It's shocking to me how superficial so much media coverage is, but it seems like Epoch Times has made a real effort to get to a more substantive and deeper, look at these questions. So I'm grateful to you guys.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, because isn't this what journalism is supposed to be about? And this is frankly a fascinating discussion. It actually makes me think of this, one of your newer Substack pieces about why you are no longer progressive. This safetyist, as you described thinking, is kind of a centerpiece of this.
Yeah, I mean, I have lifelong progressive, adult progressive, lifelong Democrat my entire life. I am no longer a progressive. When I'm 50 now, and when I was in my 20s and even in my 30s, there was still a sense among progressives of a kind of we can do it attitude, the famous image of Rosie the Riveter. But even when Obama was running, it was yes, we can. The message was of empowerment, that humans are capable, that we achieve amazing things, we're innovative, we're adaptive. There was a sort of celebration of our ability to do anything. Now, people that call themselves progressives, the progressive movement, is really focused on victims. It's really focused on rescuing victims, playing the victim, which is pathological in many cases. It's determined to rescue people, which is the desire. In some ways, it's a power trip. Make other people, insist that other people are weaker than you so you can save them. There's something deeply creepy about it, I think. And it's really anathema to traditional progressive left-wing politics, which embraced human power. So I'm not a progressive. Progressivism, I think, has become more of a kind of pathological altruism than an empowering framework. I'm not crazy about any of the labels available to us, but I think people understand what I'm referring to, which is that I want to describe myself in a tradition of people that celebrate overcoming oppression, whether from Moses to Martin Luther King to the people of Taiwan that are heroically resisting Chinese domination and Hong Kong. Those are and the people that resisted apartheid. Those are the people and movements I support and valorize. I'm not on board with treating the Bangladeshis as helpless to deal with a 0.5 meter sea level rise. It's patronizing, it's insulting, and I think it reflects something quite neurotic and hysterical.
I mean, it seems it's a fundamental shift in values, really, right? So it's just enshrining the victim as the core of it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's just that dumb. I wish I could say that there was something more intelligent behind it, but it really is that stupid. It's the idea that victims are more moral than anybody else, and that we can kind of categorize people as either victims or oppressors. We know that that people are victimized, people are hurt, people are oppressed by other people, but that's not the end of the story. In the classic hero's journey, which is the archetypal journey for many religions and for many Hollywood movies, being victimized and hurt is part of the journey towards heroism. It's you overcome those external oppressors. You tap your inner resources. It's about mentality. It's about overcoming. It's about belief. And to some extent, I think it's about having some faith in oneself and faith that you will overcome. And that's been the heart of really our greatest spiritual and political traditions for thousands of years. That's the part that gives me some hope, is that I just don't think that this victim worship or victim ideology or victimology can last, because the vast majority of us don't think of ourselves as victims. We don't want our children to think of themselves as victims, and we don't want to associate with people that are going around and labeling other people victims and helpless. I think we are starting to see a backlash against it. It's notable how many, I had a very strong response to that article from many different people of many different outlooks saying, thank you, you've really tapped into something that I have felt. And I think, we just got through a really terrible year with COVID. We're still coming out of it. But I think that people are not going to come out of that and want to continue to indulge in this really patronizing and neurotic ideology.
What's really interesting is, this, I guess, outlook somehow, fits into all of these questions that you're exploring, whether it's climate or COVID, right? I think as well. I've seen compelling arguments that it has something to do with how we've dealt with Afghanistan recently too. So
yes,
it's fascinating. And obviously very deeply disturbing.
Yeah, and for sure, I see it everywhere. I support strong action to prevent the spread of coronavirus, particularly at the beginning parts of the pandemic. But we have a vaccine, and we should celebrate our vaccine. But this idea of masking children, that's bonkers. They don't do that in Europe. They're not doing that in the Netherlands. This idea that we couldn't maintain with 2,500 people a modest presence in Afghanistan, and that we had to flee like in a panic. But we also see it in reaction to what I think is the biggest problem in America right now, which is drug addiction, drug abuse. 93,000 Americans died last year from drugs, from illicit drugs. It's almost 3 times as many people as die from car accidents. It's about 4 times as many that die from homicides. It's our number one cause of accidental death. And the response from many people, many progressives, many people on the left, has been of helplessness, that there's sort of nothing we can do about this, which is completely absurd. We've been dealing with addiction for well over 100 years. We know that that people require some pressure, some coercion to quit. I don't think anybody, at least in California or the United States, cares much about people that choose to be addicts in the privacy of their own home. But homeless street drug addicts are destroying California cities. It's happening around the United States. I was just in Denver 2 nights ago, and I was appalled by what I was seeing on the streets. The behaviors were illegal and completely inappropriate by people that are addicted to hard drugs. And the response from many progressives is that there's sort of nothing you can do about it, that you just sort of have to wait for people to decide on their own. And then giving permission, effectively, not enforcing the law against people who have been categorized as victims. So this is really disturbing, but we're basically seeing progressive prosecutors saying, and progressive city council saying, we should not enforce laws against things like public defecation, public drug use, camping on sidewalks by people who have been determined to be victims, allowing them basically to self-destruct in public view and creating public safety hazards, public health hazards, public nuisance problems. This would look absolutely bizarre to our parents and our grandparents who had some sense of propriety, some sense of personal discipline. And when people fell off the wagon, people have a hard time. I myself had a drinking problem that I ended 3 years ago with some pressure from family and friends, and I'm very grateful to that. We're all familiar. We all have problems. But this idea that we should let people destroy themselves because they're victims is bizarre and obviously wrong. The recall election is really heating up in California. It's been very fascinating to see. And I think you've seen the two progressive ideologies, victim ideology on the one hand, and really pagan nature worship on the other, be challenged. I'm working on a column now about how much progressives hate the front runner, Larry Elder. He's African American, conservative. I think the reason they hate him so much is that he proves that racism is less of an issue in political life than it's ever been. If it were more of an issue, then they would hesitate to hate him. They genuinely hate Larry Elder because he is a Republican and he opposes their views on so many things, and they're not letting race get in the way. And I think that plus the fact that Larry Elder is loved by so many people that voted for Trump and by so many Republicans proves that racism is less of an issue than it's ever been in American political life. And I think that only feeds the hatred and upset among many progressives.
Right. And of course, for full disclosure, Larry has been on this show and actually has the Larry Elder Show for Epoch Times.
Yeah. And by the way, I should say I lifelong progressive, but I actually endorsed a different candidate. So I'm not making a statement at all about Larry Elder. But it is to say that his main point, which is that racism is not the most important obstacle facing African Americans or any other group in the United States, is obviously correct, because it's not the main obstacle facing Larry Elder. I mean, one of the most remarkable and under-discussed issues in the entire recall is that California could have a black governor. That's a historic event. I mean, when you have a first black anything, firefighter, president, senator, mayor, police chief, it's major news. We talk about it. We celebrate it, as we should. But the mainstream progressive media have basically said nothing about this fact. And I find that very fascinating.
So, Michael, at the risk of getting you to kind of reveal your whole book, upcoming book here, what are some of the solutions that you've been envisioning to this drug problem? I think you're saying that it's not necessarily something new and rocket science.
Yeah, every country that has dealt with this problem of drug addiction, drug overdose, drug poisonings has done the same things. Really three things. The first is that you must shut down the open-air drug markets. You can't allow the dealing and selling of drugs that are killing people. So we need to shut down the open-air drug markets, the open-air drug scenes. That's number one. Number two is that we need to have a shelter-first housing earned policy. Right now, we, as official national policy, we just give away apartment units to people without condition, without requiring that they address their addiction or mental illness. Well, that doesn't work because that's the underlying reason that people become homeless, is because of addiction and untreated mental illness. So a better approach is to have enough homeless shelters to shelter everybody that's on the street, require them to use it, and then let them earn their own apartment, either through drug treatment, sobriety, or other progress on their personalized plans towards living a better life. And that includes having a job. And then the third part of it is that we need to centralize, make efficient, make accountable psychiatric and drug treatment at the state level. It also needs to happen nationally, but we just have a broken system. It's broken in so many different ways. So we're proposing in California something that we call CalPsych, which would basically take over from the failed counties and the failed nonprofit subcontractors the work of getting people into drug treatment, getting people the psychiatric help that they need. We think actually it'll save money, because right now we have so many duplicative efforts, paying two different nonprofits or two different healthcare providers to treat the same person multiple times. It's clearly not working. And the great news, Jan, is that we've created a coalition of parents, whose kids have been killed by fentanyl, parents whose kids are addicted to fentanyl, addicts, former addicts who are in recovery and are incredible spokespeople, and then neighborhood activists who are negatively impacted by homelessness. We've all come together to see that we have the same interest in addressing this problem and fixing this problem. We've calling ourselves, because it's so much chaos, we've called ourselves the California Peace Coalition, and now we're broadening to the American Peace Coalition.
Well, and, two things that just jumped to my mind. One is, the keyword is accountability, and it seems like from what we've talked about, that's not something that fits with the progressive ideology very well, right? And number two, the elephant in the room, fentanyl, China, under the Communist Party, passed laws apparently to limit the production and export of fentanyl. And 2020 was the banner year for, these precursors and so forth coming in. And, basically these people producing this stuff working with the Mexican cartels to bring it into the US. So how do you see that changing?
Yeah, I think the dominant characteristic of many progressive policies right now is getting rid of accountability, actually eliminating accountability. That's what the trend has been. So it's been about not holding drug addicts accountable for their behavior. It's been about not holding government officials accountable for their behavior. It's been about not holding countries accountable for what they do. China did not have 93,000 of its people die last year from illicit drugs. The United States did. And yet much of that fentanyl came from China through Mexico. It's completely ridiculous. The US government is acting helpless to stop fentanyl from poisoning our children. We're getting kids who are suffering from anxiety and depression. They should have access to medical help, to psychiatry, to get on maybe an antidepressant or have some therapy or exercise more or be in community, and they're not getting that. And these kids are self-medicating, they're experimenting with pills, and many of these pills are now being contaminated with fentanyl, and these children, Jan, as young as 14 years old, are being found dead by their parents on their bedroom floors. This is absolutely unacceptable. We are losing our humanity. We're losing our civilization, we're losing our cities in progressive states like California, but we're really losing our shared humanity. Real civilizations, real societies, Europe, Japan, they simply do not allow for this kind of thing to continue. And so we are building a movement to stop it. I am confident that we will stop it, but we really need to raise the alarm on this issue. It's a much more serious problem, to put it mildly, than climate change.
So, Michael, any final thoughts as we finish up here?
Just to say that I think we are in a transition period from a dying, older paradigm to something new, something that doesn't fit as easily into categories of left and right. And in some ways, I think it's a very dark time. But in some ways, I think it's a very exciting moment, because I think what's going to come next over the next few years and what it means for American political life could be very positive.
Well, Michael 쉘lenberger, I truly appreciate your optimism, as you mentioned, in times which can appear to be very dark. It's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thanks for having me, Jan.